Hello, everybody. We're going to spend a few minutes talking about crime and then lead our way into torts, which is the other part of our module this week. And I know I posted in our discussion board that concept that ignorance of the law is no excuse. So I'm looking forward to seeing what you all say about this with each other. And of course, there's no right or wrong answers. That's the whole purpose of a discussion board. Wanted to give you a little more background on it, just even based on what I'm seeing already as people's impressions of the law. And one thing is that, of course, we do in a crime because of what we've seen as our penalty in crime, and knowing that there's potential for somebody to be put in jail or have a fine, or it could be worse for the penalty. And when we think of that, we think crime and punishment, those two to go together. And that's a very serious matter. And that's why we've set up standards like the idea that the government, the prosecutor, whether it's the prosecutor in a state prosecution, which we call a district attorney, or in a federal prosecution, we call the U.S. attorney. And either way, that's a representative of the government. And so we expect that high burden beyond a reasonable doubt, the amount of evidence that it would take for that person to be, and we're saying now the defendant, convicted of this crime and have that punishment applied. Well, all of this has a very heavy tone, and it should when we're talking about a criminal action. And yet, I want to take a step back and look at why that is and what it is that we really look at as the purpose, we citizens in this country, as the purpose of criminal law. We're thinking about each other ultimately. We're thinking we want our citizens to be kind to each other. We want them to be responsible to each other and not harm each other. That's the very first thing that we're looking at. And so when somebody takes an action or even considers taking a negative action like that, we want them to really be taking it seriously because we as citizens expect a higher level of behavior. Now, if you think of all of that, then the rest kind of falls into place and makes sense. The procedures make sense. The idea that we want this to be a fair trial and we want this to be a fair and impartial jury, as we've talked about in previous chapters, we've set the stage, so to speak. And so when we look at those kinds of things, and we're at the end of our trial, remember, we have a jury of our peers. And the jury of our peers gets to determine, has the government proved each element of the crime charged beyond a reasonable doubt? And if so, what would be the appropriate punishment? All of that is done by a jury of our peers. And it's because we are the common sense folks, we the citizens, right, in our jury. We wouldn't want this to simply be the judge. The judge instructs the jury on the law, and then the jury applies the law and takes the elements of the crime charged and sees, has this defendant done those things? And remember, we are not a fly on the wall. We can't say for sure. So really the way we frame it in legal terms is, has the government met its burden to prove based upon the evidence? And we look now at the evidence and see if it fits when we apply the law, whether there is a crime that has been proven beyond a reasonable doubt to have been committed by this defendant. So that's the broad way we look at crime. And when I say ignorance of the law is no excuse, it's a good expression that's been around for a very long time for a reason. And it's to remind us, well, we don't want our citizens to go around with blinders on like this and actually not learn the law. That's why you're all here, to learn the law, right? Because if we were to reward somebody, think of it this way, we're always thinking two steps ahead in the legal system and in how we apply it and shape it and really set it out. And so if we were to say, we're only going to hold you responsible if you intend to do that action. Well, certainly we want there to be some level of intent. We don't want to punish somebody for not doing something on purpose. That's that mens rea intent element. But yet we're going to interpret that broadly, because if we were to say, well, you have to know that when you did this action, that it was a crime. And therefore, now you have the criminal element. If we went that far, it would really incentivize our citizens not to know what the law is. Then they could say, well, I didn't know it was against the law to take a gun and shoot a person. Do you need to know all the elements of the crime of murder in order to be convicted of murder? No. The jury will be given the elements and use a standard. We call it a reasonable person standard generally in law. And so we say, well, this defendant is guilty of the crime charged if the government has proved beyond a reasonable doubt that he knew or should have known. Now, when we use that word knew or should have known, we've added that to parentheses. It's to add in there that element that you don't have to technically know that it's a crime to shoot somebody, but you should have known it. Now, you might say, well, how do you know that this person should have known? That's one of the functions of the jury. The jury gets to decide what's reasonable. That's the reasonable person standard. And the jury gets to decide things like knew or should have known. We can't go inside the person's head. We can't require the government to prove that much of an x-ray machine in somebody's head. And so we use the standard that we allow the jury to then use their common sense and figure out, well, what is what we consider our citizens to have known? And what should they know to be citizens in our society? And that's the level we want to hold our fellow citizens, our neighbors, and those of us, our fellow travelers here in this country, right? We want to hold them to that standard. So I'll give you two concrete examples. One, in the area of criminal law, if you are told by a friend, let's say, or somebody, well, I've got a great price on golf clubs. They fell off the truck. There might be a wink, wink in there, by the way. Well, that means those are stolen goods. And if you then purchase those goods, you are guilty of a crime of purchasing stolen goods. You might say to me, but wait a minute, I didn't know that that means they're stolen goods. Well, we have a jury of peers for that. So if really nobody knows that, well, it's not going to meet the standard of should have known. But if it turns out that everyone sitting in the jury room, those fellow jurors say, well, when I hear that, I know those are stolen goods. And I'm sure there are plenty of people in this class that know that. Well, then you are held to the same standard. We don't want you walking around with life naive. And that is a way that, yes, people can get into trouble, perhaps unintentionally. And that's one of the reasons you're taking this course, so that you will learn what the law is in this area. You'll know more perhaps than most people, and that will help protect you when you take these actions or consider taking these actions. And the other example I use of this in the criminal context is for securities violations, which are crimes. If you were to buy and sell stock that has been based upon your decision to purchase, has been based upon inside information, that's insider trading. And we're going to talk about this later in the semester, but it violates the Securities Act and it's a federal crime. Well, if somebody comes up to you and says, I have a great hot stock tip, buy Telecom stock, that may mean that they got inside information. I say may because generally people recognize those words hot stock tip to mean that. And there'll be a jury of peers later on who get to decide, well, is that reasonable? Do we really think that that's what that means? And if so, yes, you can't say, well, I didn't know that that's what that meant. So I wanted to give you a little bit of the incentive for you to maybe to learn the law, but also to understand really how we look at criminal law in a broader way. You're, of course, going to learn in the module all the different elements and what it is that we require. And you'll see it is a very high burden for the government to prove each of these things. And we do that intentionally because we really want to make sure that somebody really is I'll say a malfeasor, right? Somebody is really somebody who's done something bad before we punish you for doing that. And of course, we're going to set the bar pretty high for the government to prove that. But yet, the best way to avoid getting into trouble is to not take the action to begin with. And we are, in a way, holding out to society as examples. People have gotten into trouble, and you see it and then I better not take that action. The same is true, by the way. Now we're going to shift a little bit into torts. The same is true in a tort situation where we think civilly, maybe for that same exact incident, the same action you're about to take could have a civil consequence. And in that case, if you take that action, you are still called a defendant, and now a fellow citizen, it could be a company or an individual, is going to sue you for money damages for the injury that took place. And so, in that sense, it could be money that was lost, that was swindled. It could be a civil situation in the sense that we're not talking about jail now, we're talking about two individuals or companies that are suing each other, as we've talked or learned about in how this goes in our legal system. And I'm putting them in the same breath and the same module because they really have a similarity in terms of the purpose. We're holding our citizens up to this higher standard. And so we're going to see in the upcoming videos the types of torts there are. And when we do that, you'll see that there's three broad categories of kinds of situations that could be considered a tort. I say could be, we'll learn more about that, but there's going to be intentional torts, negligence torts, and strict liability torts. So there'll be different definitions, and I'll tell you right up front that the one that most resembles crime, because that's where we're starting here, is going to be an intentional tort because somebody intended to take the action, whether they knew or even should have known the consequence that would flow. They actually did something deliberate in their action. Maybe they didn't know the level of damage it would cause or that the person would in fact be injured, but they did some kind of deliberate action or failed to take an action that a reasonable person would have done. For instance, if they got behind the wheel of a car and drove through a red light, well, maybe they didn't intend to hit another car. Maybe they were in a rush. Maybe they were not intending to cause harm to another person, but harm did result. That would be a tort potentially if all those facts are proven with that lower standard we do for civil. And so if that is really what happened, then this person is going to be held legally responsible in a civil way and pay money damages. In a case that I just described, in that little hypothetical, that could be a negligence action. It wasn't that they intended to go and injure somebody, but they drove in a way that was unreasonable by going through that red light. And so that would be one of the elements that you're going to learn for negligence. But if that person was doing something intentionally, really wanted to go through that red light in an intentional sort of way, we might call it something else. We might call it battery. We're going to see some of these intentional torts. It's in a way, it's an assault because you are harming somebody and you're doing it intentionally. That rises the level up. And if somebody we're going to see this in a bit, have alcohol in their system or some other substance, they're driving under the influence, well, that again is a higher level of culpability, something that's even worse. And so we're going to hold them more responsible as a result. And in any of that, you wouldn't be able to, as a citizen, say, oh, well, gee, I didn't know or I didn't intend to do it if you did something that we as fellow citizens consider to be very egregious, is a bigger word for that, but very bad, we're going to hold you to a higher consequences. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. But I wanted to first tell you a little bit more about ignorance of the law and crime and why we're all in this class, because you're going to learn those things and know much more than the average citizen. And yet, remember, there is a jury of peers, your fellow citizens, that are taking this into account when we decide, even on the civil level, what is reasonable? What is the reasonable behavior that we want our citizens to carry out? And we will hold them responsible for money damages if it's a civil case, criminally, maybe even if it's worse, and have there be a higher consequence for their actions. And this shapes our incentives as we go forward in society and have a safer and happier society as a result. And that's one of the functions of the law. So more on that soon, and stay tuned. Thank you.